and welcome to our podcast, EPG Talks. My name is Anna Maria Niculicea, and I'm going to be your host for today. I'm joined by Luciana Miu, who is the head of the Clean Economy program here at EPG, and we're going to talk about the ConsenCUS project, one of EPG's CCUS projects, the work we're doing in it, some key findings, as well as future outlooks. Welcome, Luciana. It's a pleasure to have you back on the podcast.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So, could you start by telling us a few words about the ConsenCUS project, what EPG is doing in it?
Sure. Happy to take that away. Thank you. So I think it's first important to talk a little bit about CCUS. And when we say CCUS, we mean carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And these are some really interesting technologies that have emerged into public attention, especially recently, because we are headed towards a significant rise in global temperatures due to human-induced climate change. And we have realized that one of the things we need to do is to actually remove carbon dioxide either before it reaches the atmosphere, so from point sources like industrial waste gases, or directly from the atmosphere, because we've built up such a huge concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we might actually need to remove some of it. I say might, it's fairly certain that we will need to do this. And so carbon capture, it's in the name, it involves capturing the carbon dioxide either before it reaches the atmosphere or directly from the atmosphere. What happens then is that the carbon dioxide is usually compressed and transported to either be utilized. It can be utilized in a product, for example, in producing synthetic fuels, or it can be stored underground for permanent geological storage. And again, these are technologies that have really come into the public eye in the European Union, which doesn't have very many CCUS projects, commercial scale projects just yet, but has recognized that CCUS will play an important part in the climate neutrality target the Union has set for itself in 2050.
Yeah.
So, go ahead.
Yeah. No. I was just thinking that basically we reach kind of the point where CCUS is important.
Absolutely.
Because there's no turning back.
Absolutely, yes. We have reached a point where we do need to start thinking about carbon removals. We need to start rolling out these technologies to prevent more carbon dioxide from building up in the atmosphere and reaching global warming temperature increases that lead to basically climate catastrophe, for want of a better words. And this has been recognized by the EU in its flagship Green Deal initiative. CCUS was highlighted as one of the key technologies that the European Union will need to implement. In the recent Net Zero Industry Act, it's also been highlighted as a strategic technology for reaching net zero, carbon capture and storage, that is. So we're really seeing a lot of activity right now around CCUS, but at the same time, it's still quite early days for the European Union. And one of the things that we're trying to do in the ConsenCUS project, which I'll talk a little bit more about that, is to try and realize how this rapid rolling out of large-scale CCUS is actually going to be taken up by society, right? Because whenever we talk about a transition, we're not just talking about technologies, we also need to understand how these technologies fit into society and what we might need to think about in terms of behavior change or in terms of dialogue with the public to ensure that these technologies actually achieve their full impact. So a bit about the ConsenCUS project, because you asked. So indeed, this is one of EPG's flagship projects on CCUS. It's funded under the Horizon 2020 program. And the main work that's being done is that our partners in the Netherlands and in Denmark are developing a capture and conversion technology for carbon dioxide. So they have come up with a new way of capturing carbon dioxide from industrial waste gases and converting it into a useful product. The product is called potassium formate, and it's a biodegradable product with a lot of different uses. It can be used as animal feed, it can be used in de-icing, for example, runways.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, so there is a market for it, for sure. So a lot of the work that's being done is quite technical, but EPG's role is to assess the potential social impact by trying to understand how the public will perceive these technologies and CCUS in general. And the way that we do this is by doing something called monitoring narratives around CCUS. So why is this important? It's basically because CCUS is a little known technology or portfolio of technologies right now.
And in the European space.
In the European space, and there are variations between countries, but overall, people know less about CCUS than they know about, for example, wind energy or solar energy, which have been in the public eye for quite a long time. And what happens is when you have this lack of awareness and knowledge, people's opinions tend to be dictated quite a lot by the new information and opinions they receive from opinion makers. So, for example, the media or public institutions or even individuals that citizens sort of look to and trust. So that information comes in and they absorb it and formulate their own opinion. Now, obviously, it's a much more complex process than what I'm sort of describing now, but it is very important to understand how the public is going to perceive CCUS technologies, not least because, especially when we talk about the carbon dioxide transport and storage, these are large infrastructure projects, right? They're very expensive, they're very disruptive, and we have seen past examples in the European Union of social resistance to carbon capture and storage, especially because storage sites located near communities do engender fears of, for example, the carbon dioxide leaking out of the storage site.
Okay, so we're talking about onshore storage, because
yes,
as far as I know from my previous knowledge, there's also offshore.
Absolutely. No, thank you for bringing that up. So we do have options to store CO2 underground, so onshore, or offshore, so under the seabed.
All right.
And the largest projects and the oldest projects that have been going on in the European Union and Norway do involve offshore storage.
All right.
And this comes with pros and cons. Obviously, it's one of those things, out of sight, out of mind. It's not perceived as riskily by local communities because it's just further away from them. There's less of the not in my backyard, which is a phenomenon that is quite frequently seen, including with renewable energy installations, where there's this effect that the closer this is to my backyard, the more risky I might perceive it, the more disruption I might see from it. But on the other hand, offshore storage is much more expensive, simply because of the environment within which you need to operate. You need to inject under the seabed. So that is the other drawback.
Yeah, but I guess this aspect could also create contention, like people wondering why the taxes are being put into this kind of technology.
Absolutely, yeah. So the fear of...
It's so expensive.
Indeed. So the fear of carbon dioxide leakage is only one, I think, of the sort of risks associated with CCUS by the public. There are others, for example, what's called fossil fuel lock-in risk. So there is this risk that if carbon capture is applied to, for example, fossil fuel power plants, it will give them a license to continue operating because they can just capture their carbon dioxide emissions and store them underground and continue operating. There's obviously issues with that, and we don't, at EPG, we don't advocate for using carbon capture as a way to prolong the use of fossil fuels, but it is a very real risk, especially in countries which are dependent on coal and gas power, that carbon capture might be seen as a lifeline for these industries.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Turning back to the work that EPG is doing, could you tell us a little bit about the ConsenCUS project per se, and like the methodology, more about the narratives?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned, the ConsenCUS project is focused on developing this novel method for capturing and utilizing carbon dioxide that is going to be tested in 3 member states at specific industrial facilities. One in Denmark, that's a cement producer, one in Greece, a magnesite producer, and one in Romania, an oil and gas refinery. And for this reason, we have focused the work that we're doing around public perception and narratives on these 3 countries. So more precisely, what are we doing? We have been monitoring the narratives around CCUS in major media outlets and from major institutions, whether that's authorities or companies or NGOs in these countries. We've started out with with recording these narratives from a baseline year because we wanted to know before the start of the ConsenCUS project, what were the prevailing narratives around CCUS in the 3 member states that we're looking at, so that then as the project goes on, it's a long project, it's due to end in 2025.
That's a lot of time.
It is, and is quite common for Horizon projects, but that gives us a real opportunity to also see how narratives evolve over time. Exactly. And whether projects like the ConsenCUS project or all the other, frankly, there are a lot of CCUS projects ongoing right now, whether that's sort of commercial scale implementation or research and development, trying to see whether those altered narratives over this period of 4 years as well. So we've done that sort of baseline study of the narratives in Denmark, Greece, and Romania, and since then we've been monitoring as we go along to see how it evolves and what changes there might be. It's a huge volume of work, as I'm sure you know, because you're also involved in the project. Yeah. So we've had to restrict the sources that we look at for the narratives. So what we basically do is we choose the 5 most circulated national media publications for general circulation, the 5 most accessed specialist media publications, so ones that have more of a focus on energy and climate change. And we also look at relevant national authorities, the top 10 emitting companies in each country, and the relevant NGOs that might be interested or writing about CCUS. There's not a lot of them, especially in Greece and Romania.
Yeah, that's true.
CCUS is not really sort of out there as an issue for NGOs to pick up on. But so we basically look at all the publications that mention CCUS from these sources across the time period that we're talking about. And we scan them, we do quick summaries of them, and then we use a methodology called the narrative policy framework to basically decide whether these communications, media articles, public statements, and so on, can be qualified as a narrative. And for this, we use the NPF, which is a quite well-established method, and we look to see whether the sources fulfill certain criteria, because what we want to see is whether these sources are forming narratives or storylines around CCUS. Now, narratives are important because they create this story, and it's much easier for the public to relate to it.
Yeah, exactly. It's more relatable, I guess.
Exactly. There has been research that has shown that people tend to respond differently to statistical information, so just facts, versus a story about something. And it's a communication method that is quite frequently used because, for example, as a journalist, you want to capture your reader's attention. And it's easier to do that if you're presenting a plot with some characters like a hero or a villain, which are components of the narrative policy framework.
And I guess it's also easier for the general public to digest an information that's so technical, like CCUS, because we're talking about the technology.
Yes, absolutely. We're talking about the technology. We're talking about it in the context of climate change and reaching net zero greenhouse gas emissions, which is still quite a technical concept for a lot of people in the lay public to wrap their heads around. So one really useful way to capture and direct attention towards these technologies is to form some kind of narrative around it. And narratives are interesting because they also carry with them the sort of priorities of the authors. So if you have an institution that is concerned about the economic impact of climate change and losing jobs, for example, because heavy industry might need to shut because they're just too high emitting to be able to continue operating under a tightening climate policy in the EU. If you're an institution that has a mandate to talk about this, you might be putting forward an economic narrative or an employment narrative about CCUS. Putting carbon capture on an industrial facility that has no way to continue operating unless it captures its emissions will save jobs, it will safeguard the local economy, and so on. Whereas if you have an environmental NGO, they might put forward a climate and environment narrative around CCUS, talking about how it's a way to reduce emissions and to help us get to net zero and to avoid climate catastrophe. So narratives are really interesting for that reason, because they kind of show what the media and the sort of public institutions and companies and so on are prioritizing with regards to CCUS and how they are framing it. But also they can give us an idea of what's important for the public and what sort of messages might resonate the most with the public when we talk about CCUS.
Yeah. I basically like some kind of lenses that you use to filter a message that you want the general to be reachable for the general public.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good way of putting it. So for that reason, we've chosen to look at these narratives, and we already find some quite interesting things just from the relatively short period that we've done monitoring on.
Yeah, so here's my next question.
Sure.
Can you tell us a little bit of some key findings of the study?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the standouts has been the difference between Denmark and on the one hand and Romania and Greece on the other hand. Now, Denmark is a really interesting case because actually up until 2020 they had a ban on CO2 storage, except for if you were injecting it offshore for the purpose of enhanced oil recovery, which is, it's another interesting, I'm going to just pause here to talk a little bit
Okay.
about enhanced oil recovery.
We have all the time in the world, don't worry about it.
So enhanced oil recovery is actually one of the earliest ways that CO2 has been injected into the subsurface. And it's injected into oil or gas deposits, for they have enhanced gas recovery, for the purpose of extracting as much oil or gas as possible out of these deposits once they've become too depleted to do extraction by traditional methods. So that's been happening for quite a long time in North America. And it's very interesting if we think about public perception about the sort of prolonging the use of fossil fuels narrative, that this has sort of been such a prevalent option for CO2 storage. And it's been that way for a long time because before sort of policy came in and said, okay, we're going to subsidize CO2 storage, we're going to help cover some of these very high costs of transport and storage infrastructure and so on. Extracting extra oil and gas was a way to make money. You know, it's an extra revenue source. And
and in the fossil fuel industry.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it was kind of basically it was serving the interest of the fossil fuel industry.
And it's a way to cover costs and to justify those investment costs in a CO2 injection facility, for example. Now, this has been the case in North America. In Europe, it's been more sort of focused on CO2 storage for the purpose of just storing CO2 and keeping it away from the atmosphere. So it's much more embedded in a climate narrative than in a business narrative.
Yes. And actually, because I don't want to jump the gun, but
sure.
Maybe we can go back again to this idea that you have this previous history of how people framed CCUS, that, okay, it's serving the fossil fuel industry and interest, but now there's like this rebranding CCUS in Europe, like CCUS is going to save the climate, because we're repurposing it and giving it other values. And I see this narrative quite often in Denmark.
Yeah, no, definitely. So absolutely, I think that CCUS has emerged as a climate mitigation tool quite a lot. And going back to Denmark, so until 2020, they had the ban on carbon dioxide storage, except for the purposes of offshore enhanced oil recovery, because Denmark has a long history of oil and gas production, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And since 2020, things have just changed so much. So going back to Denmark, it's a really interesting case, again, because until 2020, CO2 storage was banned except for the purposes of offshore enhanced oil recovery. And Denmark has a really long history of oil and gas production and exploration. And one thing that I think really triggered an interesting new narrative around CCUS is that either in late 2020 or in early 2021, I can't quite remember, they introduced a ban on new oil and gas production in Denmark. So all of a sudden, that opens up a whole new sort of business opportunity for the North Sea in terms of we've had all of these jobs and we've had all of this economy that's been sort of fed by oil and gas production from the North Sea. Now we can use CO2 storage as a way to continue economic activity and to continue providing jobs. So that's been a narrative that's quite present in Denmark after all of this activity started taking place. So just to go sort of chronologically, the ban on new oil and gas exploration actually came alongside a political agreement to support carbon capture, utilization, and storage in Denmark. So there's just this huge policy shift. And if you speak to stakeholders from the Danish government, they will tell you as well, it's just been moving at such a fast pace, going from a ban on CO2 storage and previous public resistance as well to tentatives for CO2 storage onshore, right up to these political agreements, subsidies, lots and lots of subsidies being awarded.
There's a huge amount of like political commitment around CCUS in Denmark.
Yes, absolutely. And it goes across parties as well. So Denmark has this tradition where they have what's called cross-party agreements for certain issues, and CCUS is one of them. So basically all parties that are represented reach an agreement that they will support something in the future, in this case CCUS. And that's quite strong because what we heard as well in some forums from the Danish government was that tends to increase the positive perception of certain issues if it can be demonstrated that government stakeholders agree on it, that there's no sort of party colors that are supporting it and other party colors that are opposing it. So Denmark is a very interesting case. And what we've noticed in the narratives, especially in the media, is that it's very matter of fact. That's not to say that...
Could you tell us a little bit what matter of fact would mean?
Yeah, so a lot of the media articles around CCUS are quite informative, quite well-researched, presenting arguments from both sides, both for why CCUS is a good idea, why it might not be a good idea, and very targeted, so looking at the specific application of CCUS to certain industries.
Yeah, and also specific aspects of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's very thorough. And the flip side of that is that there are not really a lot of storylines being formulated around it. There's no sort of emotion. There's no portraying necessarily a lot of people or institutions as heroes or as villains or as victims. There's very little sort of plot. So this does go more towards, investigative journalism, if you want to call it that. Like, we have an issue, this is CCUS, and we know we need to apply it. We all agree on that. Yeah. We've moved past needing to sort of make the case for CCUS and more towards where is it going to be applied and how and with whose money and how's the public going to be engaged and so on and so forth. So being matter of fact doesn't mean that, there's an unclear stance on CCUS or that there's too little information about it. It just means that the subject is so advanced in Denmark that is being presented in a way that is just very thorough for and against, not pointing the finger at anyone as other narratives in other countries will do, not trying to play on people's emotions. So that's one really interesting finding from Denmark, is that...
And it's such a huge contrast between Denmark and the other
And on
countries.
The other side, Romania and Greece, absolutely. So
that kind of like have tabloid style narratives from
quite a lot
from what I've researched.
Yeah, definitely. So on the one hand, Denmark has a lot more sources that mention CCUS than Romania and Greece. So then
I feel like in Denmark, CCUS it's a topic.
Yeah,
it's a thing.
Yeah,
it's gonna be in the media. Like, you just scroll your daily news and you're gonna find something about CCUS pops up.
Yeah, maybe not your daily news, but definitely a lot more than in Romania and in Greece.
And the thing is that from what I've researched, I feel like in Greece, for example, there would be like an event that triggered mentions of CCUS, and there was this spike, and then the frequency of the articles and of the mentions just would go so down that you would not find nothing else for, I don't know, such a long period, 3-4 months.
Yeah.
While in Denmark, it's constant.
The
frequency is constant.
Yeah, absolutely. We have found so many sources that cite CCUS, both in the baseline period and in the first year of the project. Even more so in the first year of the project, because it was coming in the wake of these political agreements and announcements for subsidies for CCUS and so on. So there was a huge volume of media articles, but out of those, very few actually met the criteria of the narrative policy framework, which there's two main criteria I forgot to mention, is to have a stance on CCUS, whether it's for or against, and even ambivalent stances we sort of allow for those, and to have some kind of a character, so either a hero, a villain, or a victim. That's portrayed. A hero could be, the industry for pushing for CCUS, or a villain could be the industry for trying to put CCUS in the wrong places. A victim could be, either the environment for
or like future generations,
or people who might be losing their jobs.
Or local communities.
Yeah, exactly. And in Denmark, there were very few media articles that met these criteria. For public statements, there was a little bit more of a storyline, again, because if you as an institution are coming out and, being very proud of what you're doing on CCUS
you wrap it up.
You do wrap it up because you're trying to get people to go along with you. But we'll have to see how things evolve, though, in Denmark, because there have been some interesting developments, and we'll see how they progress in terms of whether the media might start actually taking more of a stance on CCUS. But so far, lots of sources cite CCUS. There's lots of media activity on the topic in Denmark. Not a lot of it kind of fits the narrative policy framework. On the other hand, in Romania, where the topic is far less known, you have much fewer articles that are actually talking about it. A lot of the ones that do talk about it tend to be republications from foreign sources. They tend to talk about events, like you said, that are happening outside of Romania. For example, a carbon capture and storage project being launched in Iceland. There's some media activity around that in Romanian sort of news, but nothing critical, nothing presenting pros and cons, nothing really going deep into what the technology is, and in some cases being misleading. Because one of the things that I found when I was analyzing the Romanian narratives was the media referring to carbon capture as a solution to reduce pollution. And that might sound okay, pollution, like who cares? Well, actually, carbon dioxide is not technically a pollutant, right? It's a greenhouse gas, and we absolutely need to do everything we can to reduce it, but it's not a pollutant in the traditional sense of the word. And my understanding is that the Romanian media portrays it as a pollution reduction solution because pollution is actually one of the issues that the Romanian public is concerned about when it comes to environmental issues.
All right, so basically just wrapping it up in another, I would say another narrative, the narrative about pollution. So CCUS kind of made its way into the public.
Yeah, absolutely.
It seems like you can't just directly talk about CCUS in these spaces because people don't really have an understanding, a grasp on the technology, on the concepts.
Yeah, and I think as a journalist, what you want is readership, right? And the narratives that you put forward, the way that you frame CCUS has to be in a way that will make people click or open a page and actually read your article. So it makes sense, but it also can be a bit misleading because, reducing carbon dioxide won't make the area around, a refinery, say, won't make it smell better because, you're not actually reducing the pollutants that are contributing to the olfactory pollution and so on.
Already in the atmosphere.
Yeah, or already in the atmosphere, exactly. So it's interesting because in Romania you have far less being said about CCUS, but you do have more instances of quite sensationalist approaches to it just to capture the reader's attention.
Yeah. We were discussing about like some tabloid style, like shock.
Yeah, absolutely. There was
the Elon Musk one was such a blast.
I can't quite remember the Elon Musk one.
I was like, shock. Elon Musk is gonna give like his prize money for the best CCUS technology.
Yeah.
I don't know, it would seem like me as a reader from Romania would right now go to Elon Musk and be like, here, I have the best CCUS technology, give me the money.
Yeah, which is, again, it's a way to get the readers to actually click on the article, right? Because I don't think they're going to click on an article which says, carbon capture and storage is a solution which must be implemented in Romania.
Yeah.
And I'm just saying that in a robotic voice to try and get across how unattractive that would be. So
there was the one with the alchemist, like the Icelandic alchemist saving the world.
So the Icelandic carbon capture and storage project, I think the Orca project, there was a bit of media flurry around that in Romania, and again, yes, with sensationalist titles the Icelandic alchemists who are going to save the world and so on. But once you actually go into the article, there's very little actually being said. The depth into which they go as to what CCUS is and so on is limited compared to Denmark. And that's an interesting implication for public perception, right? Because we have very little knowledge and awareness anyway of CCUS, and we are very liable to formulate opinions based on the opinion makers and what they share and how they frame things. So if the way that's being framed is as something magical, or something sensational, then that's absolutely not the entire story. And what we need in order to move CCUS forward is really concerted public engagement and public dialogue.
Definitely.
And that needs to be informed. I mean, we have examples of CCS projects that have failed in Europe because public engagement wasn't adequate. And like I mentioned, you do have social resistance especially to CO2 storage onshore. And the way to mitigate this is to have early on open and transparent public dialogue so that, you know, the public can actually form an informed opinion rather than being susceptible to all of these, you know, bombardments of tabloid style news talking about CCUS. So there are definitely implications for this, and it will give us an idea of the work that will need to be done in Romania as we move forward with carbon capture and storage projects to actually improve knowledge and awareness on the one hand and engage in transparent dialogue as well. So those are kind of some of the key findings that we've seen. There is a big variation depending on how much CCUS has been in sort of political circles, how much attention it's received, what's the experience with projects, and how it's being portrayed as and what narratives are being used. So we've seen differences between Denmark on the one hand and Romania and Greece on the other hand, that's for sure.
Yeah, in Greece, the narratives are kind of just like the same in Romania, but they also the tabloid style are there with like the Greek dream team that's gonna solve the CCUS riddle and save the planet. They were talking about CCUS projects going on, research projects going on in Greece.
And you know, I think there's a real risk here just listening to you talk about how it's being approached when you have pro CCUS articles that are so flamboyant in describing a dream team or alchemists, or it's almost something magical, isn't it? And CCUS isn't magical.
Yeah, and you can't, to me, it would be like, I can't take this seriously.
Well, that's too, but there's the real risk that the public starts viewing the CCUS either as a silver bullet that's going to solve all the problems, or as something that we shouldn't go near.
Yeah, we shouldn't trust it.
Yeah, and that black and white approach is definitely not conducive to the way we need to handle the transition to climate neutrality. CCUS is a portfolio of technologies. Some of the pathways of what you can do with the carbon dioxide, for example, utilizing it, will have a different climate impact, you know, and they will be most applicable to different industries and to different regions. And we really need to take that sort of targeted approach and view CCUS as one of many options. So putting forward these narratives of CCUS as a savior technology, or on the other hand, as something that
should be demonized,
that will poison people because CO2 is leaking out of the underground and so on, it's not constructive. We have limited bandwidth as the public, right? We are being bombarded with so much information about so many things, and many of which are frankly not on our priorities list, like climate change. You know, it's maybe not our highest priority here in Romania. So we need to make sure that the information that we are putting across is informed, it's backed up by science, it engages the reader. So you know, I'm not saying that narratives are bad. You do need a narrative to bring the public's interest alongside.
Exactly, as we said at the beginning of this discussion. They make information more digestible and more relatable.
And exactly, they relate the information to the reader's priorities, right? But we do need to really move away from the black and white approach. And we need to look at how we're reporting, not just on CCUS, to be honest, on all of these new technologies that we will need to be able to solve climate change, and really move away from black and white, from, you know, hero versus villain. I mean, obviously stories will have heroes and villains, but there's two sides to every story, and we need to be able to get that across without just pointing the public's attention into one specific direction. And
that's true, and have more of a nuanced
approach. And also, you know, it does feel a little bit sometimes like we are treating people as a bit ignorant and incapable of making their own decisions, so we need to make the decisions for them by saying that, you know, this is great or this is terrible, oppose it, or, you know, this is great, support it. And people need to be able to make their own decisions and to be critical, because in some cases CCUS might actually not be the best option for reducing emissions.
That's definitely.
So I think that's the major implication of what we're doing here is when we look at the future of CCUS projects, it is really, really important to consider public perception and how that public perception is being shaped. Narratives can be a tool, you know, to make public perception more informed and to reduce the risk of uninformed resistance to projects, because that's another thing. I'm not saying that, you know, we need to make sure that everybody agrees and accepts CCUS. In some cases, again, CCUS maybe is not the best idea and public resistance to it is actually a good thing. But we need to make sure that we understand the factors that shape it, that we avoid and prevent misinformation and disinformation, and especially in areas like Romania, Greece, Central and Eastern Europe, Southeastern Europe, where the subject is not nearly as advanced as it is in Denmark. People are less well read on it and therefore are susceptible to maybe formulating extreme opinions and responding to extreme narratives like CCUS is horrible for all of us, or CCUS is the only way forward.
All of us.
Yeah, exactly. So it might seem like the research on public perception and social acceptance of CCUS kind of takes a backseat in comparison to the actual technological development and so on, actually getting these technologies to scale and testing them and deploying them with all the costs and all the infrastructure that's needed. But knowing about public perception and social acceptance is the way to make sure these projects actually last and they're sustainable and they achieve the impact that they need to achieve, and that people buy into them where they should buy into them. So yeah, I think that's the main thing that I found from our research. Yeah.
Okay, so we're approaching the end of our discussion, which has been super interesting, and I hope that our listeners will also deem it this way. So could you tell us like some general basic ideas, some key messages that our listeners should mind when they finish watching this podcast?
Yeah, absolutely. I think as a concerned citizen, which I assume a lot of people who are listening to this podcast might be, it is to try and push for more knowledge and more awareness if there isn't enough. Like we have a responsibility also as citizens to ask that we are informed. And because of the perceived risks around things like CO2 storage, there might be an attitude of trying to avoid discussing it and trying to avoid saying too much about it. But that's not going to benefit anyone. And I think we as concerned citizens have the responsibility to ask to know what CCUS is and what role it's going to play and what value is it going to bring. So I think that's my message for concerned citizens. As for project developers and the whole sort of CCUS industry in Romania, Denmark, Greece, Europe, it would be to really pay attention to public engagement around CCUS projects. Start the dialogue early. Make sure that the engagement is transparent. It goes both ways, because these are also issues of procedural justice. You cannot expect the local community to sit by and watch as gigantic CO2 transport pipelines and injection facilities are being built next to them when they don't actually even necessarily know what CCUS is and why they should support it. So public perception is way more important than we think it is. I think that's what I would end on.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Luciana, for being here and for this wonderful discussion. Thank you so much also to our production team that is always great to have around and is making this podcast possible. And once again, thank you to our listeners for being with us. And we hope that you're looking forward to more content from EPG. Thank you.